Under the Parisian sky full of secrets, Sofia lived through increasingly dark days after discovering her husband, Louis, trapped in an affair with her own best friend Clara. Wound after wound tore at Sofia's heart, leading her through the corners of the city, from the banks of the Seine to the Old Gallery, searching for the meaning of love, betrayal, and herself. In the quiet and solitude of Paris, Sofia had to face the shadows of the past that continued to haunt her every step. The skies over Paris were a dull grey that afternoon, as if the city itself were holding its breath. A light drizzle fell gently, soaking the cobbled streets of Montmartre, blending the smell of wet earth with the warm scent of freshly baked bread wafting from the nearby boulangeries. Sofia Marchand walked slowly along the pavement, her grey wool coat wrapped tightly around her shivering frame, as a bitter wind tugged at her every step. Around her neck, a deep red scarf was wound tightly, clinging to her like a fragile lifeline against the chilling evening air. Her wet shoes made soft, almost inaudible sounds against the stone, each step a quiet protest against the growing weight of the world. She stopped before an old café, its large glass windows fogging up with the warmth inside. The soft, golden glow of the lights beckoned, offering refuge from the biting cold. Sofia pushed open the door, the soft chime of the bell resonating through the room. The heat enveloped her instantly, the rich scent of coffee and hot chocolate filling the air, mixing with the low murmur of conversations lost in the background. Without a word, Sofia made her way to a quiet corner, taking a seat by the window that looked out over the wet street. She gazed outside, her eyes straining through the curtain of rain that blurred her view. Her pale fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, hoping the warmth would soothe the turmoil that had settled deep within her. Yet, the heat of the drink seemed incapable of reaching the coldness that had taken root in her heart. Time stretched in slow, agonizing minutes. Sofia exhaled a heavy sigh, her eyes catching a familiar shape across the street. Her pulse quickened. Beneath a large black umbrella stood Louis, accompanied by a woman. Sofia squinted, her gaze narrowing as she tried to identify the woman. The rain and the street lamps painted everything in a haze, but the sound of the woman's soft, familiar laugh broke through the fog. Clara. Her old friend, and Louis's secretary. Sofia swallowed hard. Her eyes remained fixed on them, her breath shallow. Louis leaned in closer to Clara, his face a mere inch from hers, as though the world had disappeared between them. Clara's green eyes sparkled under the dim streetlights, and her smile, the same smile that once brought comfort to Sofia, now pierced her like a blade. The cup in Sofia's hand trembled, spilling a little coffee onto the small saucer beneath it. She hastily set the cup down, taking a deep breath in an attempt to steady herself. Outside, the rain fell heavier, the rhythmic patter against the window sounding like the mocking laughter of a cruel orchestra. Sofia's face drained of color. Her gaze never wavered from the scene unfolding on the wet street. Louis and Clara laughed together, their voices light and carefree, as though nothing else mattered, as though the world were theirs alone. Louis's hand casually brushed against Clara's arm, a gesture that, while seemingly innocent, crossed a line that Sofia could not ignore. Her chest tightened. A sharp ache began to spread from her heart, coursing down her arms and into her fingertips. She wanted to look away, but her eyes were locked, unwilling to escape the painful truth unfolding before her. A waiter arrived with another customer's order, the clink of plates and glasses briefly disrupting Sofia's tortured reverie. She shifted her gaze to the interior of the café, struggling to steady her breath. Yet, her heart remained unsettled. Without realizing, tears began to well in her eyes. She wiped them away swiftly, hoping no one had noticed her silent unraveling. Louis and Clara began to walk down the damp street, their shared umbrella shielding them from the rain, their steps synchronized as if they were one. Sofia's eyes followed them, her heart seeming to full with every step they took. She drained the last of her now cold coffee, its bitterness echoing in her soul. Slowly, she stood up, adjusting her scarf as it slipped from her shoulders. Her movements were heavy, as though each step were laden with the weight of her own despair. She made her way to the door, the little bell ringing softly as she pushed it open. The cold night air greeted her, the chill biting through her like 1,000 tiny needles. She walked aimlessly, allowing the rain to soak her hair, which had come loose from its neat binding. The lamps of Paris glimmered faintly through the mist, casting shadows that seemed to hide the fresh wound in her heart. Step by step, she moved down the wet pavement of Montmartre, each footfall sinking deeper into her sorrow. Her steps faltered at an intersection. In the distance, the Eiffel Tower stood tall, its lights flickering softly through the rain-soaked mist. Sofia stared at it for a long moment, as if she could find answers in its cold steel, but all that met her gaze was the quiet emptiness of the night. She sighed, lowering her eyes, and continued her walk. The city of lights shone on, indifferent to the heartache she carried. For Sofia, though, its glow no longer offered warmth, only the lingering shadows of a love that was slipping away. The night descended gently upon Paris, draping the city in a velvet shroud. The rain had ceased, leaving behind the earthy scent of damp streets that clung to the air. The city's lights shimmered warmly, reflecting off the puddles still scattered across the pavements. The cool evening breeze caressed Sofia's face as she stood on the small balcony of her apartment, her gaze fixed on the Eiffel Tower, which stood proudly in the distance, its lights gleaming faintly in the mist. Her eyes were vacant, her heart trembling with emotions she could neither name nor express. Inside the apartment, Louis entered quietly, his footsteps soft and deliberate. His black suit was damp, his hair slightly wet from the remnants of the drizzle. A foreign scent of perfume lingered faintly on his collar, a detail Sofia couldn't ignore. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his, but they remained unreadable, as if her heart had already closed off to him. Louis offered a faint smile, his expression serene, as though nothing out of the ordinary had transpired. Despite his tired appearance, there was something hidden behind the depths of his dark brown eyes, a secret that neither of them had acknowledged aloud. Sofia remained silent, her eyes studying him intently, as though wishing she could pierce through the facade he had so carefully constructed. Louis walked over to the coat rack, shrugging off his jacket and hanging it behind the door. The room was still, save for the soft ticking of the old clock that echoed in the silence. Sofia took a long breath, her chest tight with the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. "Where were you?" Her voice was barely a whisper, quiet enough that only the stillness of the room could catch it. Louis paused, glancing over his shoulder, and smiled again, this time more carefully, as if the question had already been anticipated. "A sudden meeting at the office. There was a client I had to see," he replied, his tone smooth and steady, free from hesitation. Sofia nodded slightly, pretending to accept his explanation, though her thoughts had already drifted back to the memory of Louis and Clara beneath the black umbrella earlier that evening. Their smiles, their laughter, the closeness that should never have existed. Louis moved towards the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of wine, his movements slow, deliberate. Sofia remained standing, her eyes tracking him, unable to tear her gaze away. The air between them seemed to thicken, the walls of their apartment pressing in on her, the space suddenly feeling far too small. "You look tired, Louis," she said, her voice flat. But beneath the calm, there was a swell of emotions struggling to break free. Louis glanced at her for a moment, his gaze softening briefly before he shook his head. "Let's talk tomorrow, Sofia. I'm really exhausted tonight." He walked toward their bedroom, leaving Sofia standing alone in the living room. The door closed softly behind him. Sofia sat on the sofa, her eyes glazed as she stared out the window, her heart sinking with every passing second. Louis's footsteps grew distant. The soft click of the bedroom door shutting filled the room with a finality that she couldn't escape. Sofia leaned back against the sofa, her breath shaky as she tried to steady herself. But no amount of deep breathing could calm the storm inside her. Every movement Louis made, every word he spoke, now seemed laced with lies she could no longer ignore. She turned her gaze to Louis's jacket hanging by the door, a new urge creeping through her. Slowly, as though afraid of what she might find, she rose and crossed to the coat. Her fingers brushed against the cold fabric, and she slipped her hand into the pocket. Empty. Only the faint trace of foreign perfume remained, clinging to the fabric like a secret she wasn't meant to uncover. Sofia sighed, her gaze drifting to the small table in the corner where Louis had placed his phone. She hesitated, an internal battle raging within her. She didn't want to invade his privacy, but the temptation was too strong. She stood there for a moment longer, staring at the phone, her mind swimming with doubt and suspicion. The images of Louis and Clara continued to haunt her thoughts, replaying in her mind like a film she couldn't turn off. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the thin curtains by the window. Sofia walked over to the window, her gaze once again drawn to the twinkling city below. The Eiffel Tower, still towering above the city, no longer offered her the warmth it once did. Now, it only reminded her of the love that was slowly slipping away. The night wore on, and Sofia remained awake, seated by the window. She could hear Louis's steady breathing from behind the bedroom door, calm and undisturbed. But her own breaths were shallow, quick, each one a painful reminder of the heartache growing within her. Outside, Paris continued to shine. Yet for Sofia, that night felt darker than any before. That night, Paris appeared as a dark painting, drenched in hues of melancholy. The sky hung heavy and starless, with only the city lights reflecting off the lingering puddles of the rain. The Seine flowed quietly beneath the bridge, its waters cold and sharp, as if cutting through the very soul of the city. The gentle sound of water meeting the ancient stone pillars of the bridge was the only noise in the heavy stillness. Louis stood there by the river's edge, staring at the inky black water that shimmered beneath the streetlight's glow. His figure was draped in a thick black coat, his hair slightly damp from the mist of the night. Beside him stood Clara, her body shivering in the chill, her hands pressed tightly together in front of her chest. Her blonde hair fluttered in the wind, her face tilted upward, eyes locked on Louis, filled with unspoken words. They spoke in whispers, their voices barely audible over the sound of the wind. Louis lowered his gaze, meeting Clara's piercing green eyes that sparkled faintly beneath the streetlights. His hand reached out, caressing Clara's cheek in a gesture that was far too tender for the relationship of employer and secretary. Clara offered a small smile, her fingers brushing against Louis's cold ones. "I'm tired, Clara." "Everything feels so heavy," Louis muttered, his words almost lost in the evening air. Clara looked at him intently, her gaze unwavering. "You're not alone, Louis. I'll always be here for you," she replied softly, her voice soothing, the promise lingering in the night. They stood so close now, their bodies almost touching. The cold night air carried the scent of Clara's perfume, sweet, yet sharp, like a hidden truth. Louis closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to sink into the forbidden closeness, the warmth of her presence pulling him in despite his better judgment. In the distance, behind the shadow of an old tree that lined the riverbank, a pair of eyes watched them. Sofia stood there, her body hidden in the darkness, her pale face illuminated only by the faint glow of a distant street lamp. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in the silence of the night. She had followed Louis ever since he had left the house, claiming a work meeting. His steps had led her here, to the banks of the Seine, to a place that should have borne witness to love and devotion, not betrayal and deceit. Sofia's eyes burned with unshed tears, her vision blurring, but she refused to let them fall. She stood frozen, rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to breathe as she watched the man she loved with the woman she had once called a friend. Louis spoke again, his voice fractured, laden with confusion. "I don't know what to do anymore." Clara moved closer, resting her forehead gently against Louis's chest. "Don't think about it, Louis. Just be here with me tonight." Sofia clamped her hand over her mouth, stifling the sob that threatened to escape. Her steps were slow, her body trembling with the weight of the pain that pressed against her chest. Each movement felt like an effort, as though the very earth beneath her feet were reluctant to let her go. The wind picked up, sending her loose strands of hair flying around her face. The streetlight reflected off the moisture in her eyes, adding to the shimmer of her unshed tears. She turned away, retreating into the shadows, allowing the sight of the two figures to fade from view. Her footsteps quickened as she moved through the narrow, wet streets, her shoes squeaking against the slick cobblestones. The night was growing late, the city's bustle fading into silence, with only the sound of Sofia's footsteps and the whisper of the wind to keep her company. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. Louis's words echoed in her mind, Clara's smile burned into her memory. Every moment she had just witnessed felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She didn't know where her feet were taking her. She walked and walked, hoping that somehow the darkness of the Parisian night would swallow the pain in her heart. The Seine continued its calm flow, indifferent to the suffering unfolding along its banks. Louis and Clara stood silently, unaware that the shadow that had been watching them had long since disappeared, leaving behind nothing but the silence of an unspoken wound. Morning arrived in Paris under a blanket of grey clouds. The sun was reluctant to show its face, and only a pale light broke through the thick layer of mist above. Sofia awoke with swollen eyes, the remnants of last night's tears still clinging to the corners of her vision. She sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the room that now felt strange foreign. Louis had already gone, leaving only the faint traces of soap and perfume in the air. Sofia rose slowly, her feet carrying her toward the window. The thin curtains parted, revealing a city that had just begun to stir. The wet streets shimmered, glistening beneath the weak morning light. Sofia let out a deep sigh, her chest tight with the haunting shadows that lingered in her mind. The images of Louis, of Clara, of that night by the Seine, the memories she could never escape. Today, Sofia decided, she would search for the truth she could no longer deny. With her gray coat and the red scarf that had become a constant companion, she stepped out of the apartment. Her shoes clicked softly against the slick pavement, each step heavy with the weight of the growing ache in her heart. She wandered through the narrow streets of Paris, traversing corners of the city that had once felt warm, now only offering her solitude. Faces blurred past her, strangers moving in their own worlds, none of them aware of the silent pain she carried. Her steps brought her to a stop in front of an old building, its large windows reflecting the gray morning sky. It was Clara's design studio. Sofia stood across the street, her eyes fixed on the building. Through the glass, she saw him. Louis. Her husband, standing too close to Clara, closer than what was appropriate for just a professional conversation. Louis smiled at Clara, his hand resting lightly on her arm as he spoke, his words making Clara laugh softly. Sofia held her breath, each passing second cutting deeper into her heart like a knife. People passed by her, cars whizzed past, but Sofia heard none of it. Only the sound of her own heartbeat, growing louder in her ears. She wanted to turn away, to run from the scene before her, but her feet were frozen to the ground. Finally, with the last of her strength, she turned away and walked off. Her steps faltered, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. Every corner of the city seemed to bear witness to the heartbreak that consumed her. The old walls, the fogged windows, they all stood silent, marking the slow, painful unraveling of her world. She made her way down Montmartre, passing the narrow alleys she had once walked with Louis. The memories rushed back like haunting shadows, each corner a silent testimony to their love that was now slowly falling apart. She found herself in a small park, sitting on a damp wooden bench. The wind carried the scent of freshly bloomed flowers, but nothing seemed beautiful anymore. Her hands trembled as she clutched the red scarf, now suffocating her, as though it were a reminder of the love that was slipping away. Time passed, the sky growing darker despite it still being early afternoon. The clouds hung low, heavy with the promise of rain. Sofia gazed at the wet ground beneath her, letting her thoughts sink deeper into the unspoken grief that clung to her soul. When she finally rose to leave, the rain began to fall. The droplets were soft, but enough to dampen her hair and face. Sofia walked slowly, allowing the rain to wash away the tears that fell silently, unnoticed by the world around her. Paris continued to pulse with life, its rhythm unbroken by the sorrow that consumed her. She walked home, tracing the footprints left in the corners of the city, footprints now filled with secrets and betrayals she could no longer ignore. The night sky over Paris was heavy with dark clouds. The glow of the Eiffel Tower flickered magnificently, cutting through the thin mist that had settled with the cold spring air. Sofia stood in the park surrounding the tower, her body wrapped in a grey wool coat, her red scarf billowing in the evening wind. Her dark brown hair tumbled loosely, partially covering her pale face. Her grey eyes stared blankly at the distant city lights, their glow faint against the dark horizon. The sound of footsteps reached her from behind. Slow but firm, the steps seemed to greet her silently. Sofia turned. Adrien Lefebvre stood there, wearing his worn black leather jacket, an old camera hanging around his neck. His light brown hair was slightly tousled, and his warm eyes met hers with an expression that was impossible to decipher. "It's been a long time, Sofia." Adrien's voice was a soft murmur, swallowed by the chill of the night. Sofia remained silent, her gaze locked on Adrien, filled with layers of pain. In her silence, there was longing, anger, and questions left unspoken. Adrien took a step closer, the space between them now barely a hand's width. "Are you okay?" His voice barely rose above a whisper. Sofia shook her head slowly. No words escaped her lips. The night's breeze tousled her hair, causing her eyes to glisten. She wasn't sure if it was the wind or the tears that threatened to fall again. Adrien sighed deeply. He turned his eyes toward the Eiffel Tower, then back to Sofia. "I heard about you, about Louis." At the mention of his name, Sofia lowered her gaze. Her shoulders trembled, her grip tightening on the red scarf around her neck. Adrien's hand rose hesitantly, as if reaching out to comfort her, but he pulled it back, unsure. Sofia lifted her eyes slowly. Her gaze met Adrien's, and in his eyes, she saw wounds, old ones and new ones. They stood so close now, yet it felt as though a distance far greater than physical space separated them. "You shouldn't be alone tonight, Sofia." Adrien spoke softly, as if confiding a truth to himself. Sofia inhaled deeply, her voice barely a murmur. "I just want peace. That's all." Adrien nodded, and they stood there, side by side, letting the light of the Eiffel Tower bear silent witness to a meeting that should never have happened again. The silence wrapped around them, broken only by the rustle of the wind and the gentle sound of the small fountain nearby. Adrien held his camera, as if he wanted to capture this moment, but he knew there was no image that could encapsulate the sorrow reflected in Sofia's eyes. Sofia looked up at the sky, her eyes tracing the dim light of the tower. "I don't know what to do anymore." Her voice was barely audible, only the wind to carry her words into the night. Adrien wanted to speak, to offer something, but his tongue was tied. Only his eyes spoke, saying that he was there, even though he knew he was never meant to be. The night wore on, the wind growing colder with each passing minute. Sofia tightened her coat around her, her steps slowly starting to pull her away. Adrien watched her back, letting her walk away without a word of goodbye. Beneath the light of the Eiffel Tower, their shadows stretched across the wet ground. Paris continued to shine, but the darkness in their hearts remained untouched. The Parisian sky that afternoon was veiled in shades of grey. The drizzle fell softly, washing away the footsteps of those who had passed through. Sofia stood before the large window of her apartment, her fingers gripping the thin curtain as her eyes stared blankly at the Eiffel Tower, faintly obscured by mist. Her heart felt heavy, as though all the sorrow in the world had settled upon her chest. Days had passed since her encounter with Adrien, but the images of Louis and Clara never left her. Every night, every morning, their faces appeared in her thoughts. Their smiles, their closeness, haunted her relentlessly. Sofia felt like a stranger in her own home, her surroundings foreign, as if nothing had ever been hers to claim. Louis had been coming home later and later. Every night, Sofia waited, her heart full of questions and wounds. Every chime of the clock on the wall became a sharp, aching sound in her ears. Every footstep on the apartment stairs filled her with hope, only to be dashed when it wasn't Louis who entered. That evening, Louis returned home, his steps slow and heavy. His black coat was soaked, his face tired. Sofia greeted him with silence. Their eyes met briefly, then quickly turned away. Louis hung his coat without a word and walked toward the bathroom without looking back. Sofia stood rooted in place, her gaze following his retreating back until he disappeared behind the door. Her heart ached. The Louis who used to smile upon returning home now left only an empty shadow in his wake. The following day, a small office party hosted by Louis became another excuse for him to go out late. Sofia attended, though her heart was unwilling. She stood in a corner of the room, watching Louis engage with his colleagues. Her eyes searched for one person, and indeed, Clara was there. Clara wore a simple black dress, her blonde hair neatly styled. Her green eyes gleamed beneath the party lights. Her smile was sweet, but to Sofia, it now held thorns. Their gazes met, but only for a fleeting moment. Sofia's eyes were cold, and Clara's quickly darted away. But that brief exchange was enough to reopen Sofia's wounds. In that instant, everything became clear. There was no need for more guesses, no more answers to seek. Louis glanced at Sofia a few times, but each time, he quickly turned his eyes elsewhere. Sofia stood alone, allowing the sound of music and laughter to flow past her ears without meaning. As the night wore on, Sofia stepped out of the room. The cool evening air greeted her, carrying the scent of rain that had just fallen. She walked along the pavement, letting her steps carry her away from the lies that had surrounded her. The city lights reflected in the puddles. Each reflection felt blinding, painful to both her eyes and her heart. Sofia stopped at a small bridge spanning the Seine. She gazed at the dark water flowing calmly beneath, carrying with it the city's secrets and all the wounds she had come to carry. Behind the glass of the party room, Louis stood, staring at the empty spot where Sofia had just been. His face was tense, his eyes lost the gleam they once held. But he remained silent, allowing the distance between them to grow further with each passing second. Sofia inhaled deeply, her eyes welling up with tears once more. The wind swept them away before they could fall. Beneath the dim sky of Paris, her heart grew colder, quieter, and more alone. That night, the Parisian sky was devoid of moonlight, dark and oppressive. Rain poured heavily, its ripples reflecting beneath the streetlights. The cold night wind carried a biting chill, making the city feel even more desolate. Sofia sat in the living room of the apartment, accompanied only by the faint light of a small lamp in the corner. The sound of the rain tapping against the window became a mournful melody, filling the silence around her. In front of her, a cup of tea sat cold, untouched for what felt like hours. Sofia's eyes stared vacantly at the door, waiting for footsteps she had not heard in far too long. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, marking the passage of time. Sofia pulled her red scarf tighter, as though trying to hold back a shiver that came not just from the cold, but from something deeper. Her heart raced, her chest heavy with anxiety. Finally, the sound of footsteps echoed on the apartment stairs. The door creaked open slowly, and Louis appeared, drenched. His black coat dripped with water, his hair plastered to his forehead, his face pale and tired. Sofia rose to her feet. Their gazes met briefly, but no words passed between them. Sofia's eyes were filled with pain, while Louis's were filled with an unmistakable guilt that he could not conceal. "Where were you?" Sofia's voice was soft, but loud enough to be heard over the rain. Louis looked at her for a moment before removing his coat, hanging it up without saying a word. His hands trembled slightly, whether from the cold or the turmoil inside, it was impossible to tell. "Where were you, Louis?" Sofia repeated, this time her voice firmer, but still quivering. Louis exhaled deeply, taking a step forward but halting in the middle of the room. I just went out for a bit. A bit? Sofia's eyes welled up with tears. Your nights have always been just a bit out. Louis fell silent, the rain outside growing heavier, and the distant rumble of thunder echoed through the Parisian sky. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick and difficult to breathe. Sofia stepped closer, her gaze locking into his. You're lying, Louis. I know you are. Louis closed his eyes. I didn't mean to. Didn't mean to what? Sofia fought back the sobs. Didn't mean to destroy me? Didn't mean to betray me? Louis went quiet again, his shoulders rising and falling as he struggled to catch his breath. I'm tired, Sofia. I don't know what else to do. Sofia took a step back. Tired. That's your excuse? Tired. The tears finally fell. The sound of the rain outside seemed to accompany the breaking of her heart, as though the world itself mourned with her. Louis stepped forward, reaching for her hand, but Sofia pulled away. No, Louis. Don't touch me. They stood facing each other in the dimly lit living room, the rain outside the only witness to the words that could no longer be held back. Louis lowered his head, his fists clenched. I'm sorry. Sofia shook her head, her eyes wet. Your apology is too late. That night ended in silence. Louis sat in the corner of the room, his face buried in his hands. Sofia stood by the window, staring at the faint glow of the Eiffel Tower in the distance, half hidden by the rain. Paris remained lit up, alive with its own glow, but their small home was filled with a darkness that could no longer be driven away. That morning, Paris was blanketed in thick fog. The sun was barely visible, only a faint light breaking through the gray curtain of the sky. The rain from the night before had left its mark in puddles across the cobbled streets. Sofia sat at the small table by the window, a blank sheet of paper stretched out before her. Her fingers grasped the pen, but no words came. She had been sitting there since sunrise, hoping the words would flow, but her heart was too full of pain to speak. Her gaze was vacant as she stared at the paper, her thoughts wandering to every wound that had been carved since that fateful night. Louis was still asleep in their room, exhausted from the nights filled with lies that he could no longer deny. Sofia could hear the soft sound of his breathing from behind the door, a breath that once brought her peace, now only adding to the weight in her chest. She lowered her head, trying to write. The pen moved slowly, leaving trembling strokes behind. Louis. I'm tired. She stopped. Her eyes filled with tears. Each word she tried to write felt like a knife stabbing her own heart. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the tears fall, tracing the contours of her face. Outside the window, Paris began to stir. The sound of footsteps, the hum of passing cars, yet all of it felt distant to Sofia, like an echo in her ears. The world kept moving as if it cared nothing for the wound that was tearing her apart. Sofia clutched the paper tightly. She wanted to write more, to express everything she had buried inside, but the words refused to come, stuck at the tip of the pen. She stood up, folding the paper with only a single sentence written on it. She slid it between the pages of an old book lying on the table, an old book they used to read together, now just a silent witness to the goodbye that was never spoken. Her steps were slow as she made her way to the wardrobe. She opened the door and stared at the neatly hung dresses. Her fingers grazed each one, recalling every moment they had shared. Each fabric seemed to hold a story, each fold kept a memory. Sofia chose a simple navy blue dress. She changed slowly, letting her gray coat rest neatly on the chair. She kept her red scarf on, the one thing that now seemed to shield her from the coldness of the world. That day, she walked out of the apartment. Her steps were steady, though her heart was fragile. She walked the streets of Paris, letting the morning breeze gently caress her pale face. She stopped at a small cafe on the corner of the street, a place they used to visit together. The owner greeted her warmly, but Sofia only offered a faint smile. She sat in the corner of the room, ordering a cup of coffee that she wouldn't touch. Her eyes stared out, through the misted glass of the window. Each passerby became a blur, each sound faded into the distance. Time seemed to drag. Sofia sat there, allowing herself to sink deeper into the silence. Meanwhile, back at the apartment, Louis woke up. His eyes searched for Sofia, but he found only an empty, quiet room. His hand reached for the table, finding the pen that lay there, the blank piece of paper left behind. He knew something had changed. But Louis remained silent, staring out the window at the city that continued to move without waiting for anyone. Sofia remained in the corner of the cafe, letting the day change around her in silence. Paris continued to live, but in Sofia's heart, there was only emptiness. The evening sky over Paris was a muted gray, as if it mirrored Sofia's heart, heavy with wounds. The rain fell slowly, dampening the cobbled streets, turning them slippery underfoot. Sofia walked through the narrow alleys, letting the rain soak her face. Her eyes held no more tears, only an empty gaze, holding a pain too deep to articulate. Her feet carried her to an old gallery by the Seine. The gallery was quiet, lit only by the soft yellow glow of hanging lamps. The air was thick with the smell of oil paint and aged wood, a scent that reminded her of a past now distant. Sofia hesitated before opening the door. The creaking sound of the door echoed as she stepped inside. Inside, the old paintings hung on the walls. Portraits of Paris, faces of strangers, and peaceful views of the Seine flowing calmly. Sofia moved slowly, her eyes scanning each painting, as if searching for a piece of herself within the faded brushstrokes. Footsteps echoed from behind her. Adrien appeared from behind a stone pillar, his eyes immediately locking onto Sofia. His face was filled with surprise, yet there was a sense of relief in his expression. Sofia. That was the only word that escaped his lips. Sofia turned slowly, her eyes meeting his, filled with shadows. They stood there, gazing at each other, the silent walls of the gallery bearing witness to their unspoken reunion. "Why are you here?" Adrien's voice was soft, almost afraid to disturb the stillness of the room. Sofia sighed, her gaze returning to the paintings. I don't know. My feet brought me here. Adrien stepped closer, the distance between them as thin as a shadow. I don't want you to hurt anymore. You don't deserve to carry this alone. Sofia shook her head, her lips trembling. This pain has become a part of me, Adrien. There's no place left to put it. They stood so close, yet it felt as if they were separated by 1,000 untold stories. Adrien looked at Sofia, her pale face, her empty eyes, her shoulders slumped with the weight of everything she carried. You have to stop, Sofia. You have to choose your life again. Sofia's smile was bitter. My life is already shattered, Adrien. What is there left for me to choose? The wind slipped through the crack in the old window, causing the thin curtains to sway gently. The scent of rain and old paint blended with the cold air. Adrien lowered his head, his voice barely above a whisper. You're not alone. You've never been alone. Sofia closed her eyes briefly. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw the shadows of Louis and Clara. Their smiles, their laughter, and the wound they had left behind. I'm tired, Adrien. I want to stop feeling. Adrien lifted his hand, almost reaching for her shoulder, but he pulled it back, his eyes brimming with unshed tears, the words he longed to say stuck in his throat, unable to heal the wounds that ran too deep. They stood there for a long time, letting the old gallery become a temporary escape from the world outside that continued to move on. Outside, the rain grew heavier. The city lights of Paris reflected in the puddles, dancing between the shadows that stretched across the streets. Sofia finally turned and walked away, leaving the gallery, leaving Adrien, leaving everything she could no longer hold on to. Adrien stood frozen, watching the door close softly behind her. Inside the old gallery, only silence remained, filled with the shadows of memories that lingered too long. The evening descended slowly over Paris. The sky was painted in deep orange hues, as if hiding the sun's reluctant farewell to the city. The Seine flowed calmly, reflecting the faint glow of the fading light. The evening breeze carried the scent of water and wet earth, sweeping across the old leaves that had fallen along the riverbank. Sofia stood at the edge of the river, her body wrapped in a grey coat. The red scarf that had faithfully accompanied her wound around her neck, its ends dancing in the wind. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the water's current, unblinking. There she seemed to see a reflection of herself, fragile and lost, adrift with no direction. Footsteps approached from behind. Louis stopped not far from her. His body was wrapped in a black coat, his hair disheveled, his face weary, bearing the weight of the wounds that had finally come to the surface. For the first time in a long while, there were no lies in Louis's eyes, only deep regret. Sofia heard the steps, but she did not turn. Only the wind bore witness to the distance between them, a distance that could no longer be bridged by words. Sofia. Louis's voice was nearly drowned by the gust of the wind. Sofia remained silent, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Her heart was too full to respond. Louis stepped closer but stopped several paces away. I've destroyed everything, he said, his voice cracking, heavy with bitterness. Sofia sighed deeply. I don't know anymore, Louis. I don't know what's left for us. They stood there in silence. Only the sound of the river and the rustling of leaves filled the space between them. Louis lowered his gaze, staring at his own reflection in the water. I want to fix this, the words came softly, almost in despair. Sofia turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. That gaze was no longer the look of a wife to her husband, but of a woman looking at the man she had let go of in her heart. Some things can't be fixed, Louis. There are wounds too deep to heal. Louis fell silent. His shoulders heaved as he fought to steady his breath. The wind brought a chill that cut through to his bones. The sky darkened further. The lights of the Eiffel Tower began to shine in the distance, a silent beacon in the city full of stories. Sofia took a slow step back, moving away from the edge of the river. Her steps were light, as if the burden on her shoulders was finally lifting. Louis stood still, watching Sofia's retreating figure. No words could stop her steps, no hand dared to reach out. Sofia walked along the cobblestone path beside the Seine, letting the wind slap her face, letting the memories drift away with the flowing water. Night fully enveloped Paris. The city lights flickered on, reflecting off the wet streets. The Seine continued to flow, carrying away secrets and heartaches that had never been spoken. Under the now darkened Paris sky, Sofia walked alone, heading toward a path known only to her and her heart. The last dusk by the Seine stood as a silent witness to Sofia's departing steps, leaving behind all the wounds and the shadows of betrayal that never truly faded. Paris remained aglow, the Seine continued to flow, and the city kept its secrets, words that were never spoken. Beneath the darkened sky, Sofia walked towards a path only her heart knew, leaving behind a shattered love and a story that could no longer be mended.